Officer finds a black Girl Scout selling cookies outside a local grocery store, treating her with complete disregard. "You can't sell these here," the officer sneered as he approached the young girl, who was just trying to raise money for her scout troop. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she stammered, her eyes wide with confusion. But the officer wasn't interested in listening to her explanation. "You're causing a disturbance. I'm giving you a ticket." His voice was cold, his tone dismissive. The girl tried again. "Please, I'm just selling cookies for my troop. It's for a good cause." Despite her pleas, the officer ignored her completely, scribbling out a ticket and shoving it into her hands. The girl's face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "But I don't understand. I'm not breaking any laws," she murmured, hoping for some compassion. The officer, however, couldn't have been less concerned. "It doesn't matter. You'll learn your lesson. Move along." What happens when a police officer finds the wrong person? You'll be shocked when you find out who her mother is and how it changes everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below, and stay tuned for more of this incredible story. The young Girl Scout was a hard-working and polite young girl, well-disciplined and kind-hearted. She had always been taught to be respectful to others, especially adults. She was out doing her duty as a scout, selling cookies to help her troop. Her dedication to her cause was evident as she stood, offering a smile to anyone who walked by. She wasn't asking for much, just a few moments of people's time to support her troop. But beneath her polite demeanor, there was a sense of quiet strength. She wasn't just any young girl. She was learning valuable life lessons through this experience. Though she kept her true background hidden for now, there was a subtle hint of importance in everything she did. She wasn't just any Girl Scout. She was someone who had big aspirations, ready to make a difference in the world. On the other hand, the officer she encountered was the complete opposite. He was arrogant and dismissive, someone quick to judge others based on race and appearance. His behavior often reflected the misuse of his badge and authority. He was used to enforcing his power without question and relying on intimidation. He was the kind of officer who made assumptions and acted without taking the time to understand the situation. His presence made it clear he had no interest in seeing beyond surface appearances. The young Girl Scout, still brimming with the energy and enthusiasm that only a young person could have, was simply going about her business that afternoon. She had set up her small stand in a quiet spot, hoping to sell a few boxes of cookies for her troop. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and everything seemed perfect for an afternoon of making sales. It was just a normal day for her. However, that peaceful afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. As she stood there, a uniformed officer approached her. The officer's eyes scanned the area quickly before landing on her stand. He walked over with purpose, his steps firm. The girl didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was just walking by, but when the officer stopped in front of her, she felt the shift in the air. Something felt off. "You can't be selling these cookies here," the officer said, his tone sharp and dismissive. The girl was momentarily stunned. She looked around, trying to figure out what she had done wrong. There were no signs telling her she couldn't sell cookies, and she had done this many times before in this same spot. "I'm just selling cookies for my scout troop," she tried to explain, her voice soft but filled with genuine confusion. She had no idea why the officer was confronting her so harshly. Surely there was some mistake. But the officer wasn't interested in hearing her side. "You're violating the law," he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her stand. "You can't sell here. You need to move." The girl, still bewildered, asked, "But I didn't know. What law am I breaking?" She wanted to resolve this peacefully, to explain that she was just a young scout trying to help her troop. Without listening, the officer began to get even more aggressive. "I need to see your identification right now," he demanded, pulling out a notepad and getting ready to issue a fine. "You're under arrest for loitering." The girl was caught off guard. Loitering? She hadn't done anything wrong. She opened her mouth to try explaining further, but the officer wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. His mind was made up. "You don't get to argue with me," the officer said, his voice cold and authoritative. He refused to listen, and in his mind, his badge gave him all the authority he needed to make decisions without question. He was dismissing her as if her side didn't matter at all. The officer, already irritated, showed no sign of letting up. His grip on his notepad tightened as he prepared to write the ticket, and his tone became harsher with every word. "I don't care what you're selling," he said, eyes narrowing as he glared at the girl. "Rules are rules, and you're breaking them." The girl stood quietly, her face calm despite the tension in the air. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she politely repeated, "I didn't know about any rule saying I couldn't sell here. I'm just trying to help my troop. I can move if I'm in the wrong spot." But her calmness seemed to enrage the officer even more. "Move? I've already told you, you're violating the law, and you're making it worse by questioning me." His voice was harsh, almost mocking. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you? I'm doing my job, and you're causing a scene." A few people passing by began to notice the confrontation. At first, they just stopped, curious to see what was going on. But, as the officer continued, some of them started to pull out their phones, recording the scene. The girl, still standing tall, maintained her composure, but it was clear she was growing frustrated with the officer's refusal to listen to her. Some of the onlookers glanced at each other uneasily, unsure of what to do. A few exchanged glances but didn't speak up. The officer, seeing their hesitation, seemed to grow even bolder. He didn't care about the cameras or the people watching. To him, it was just another situation where he could flex his authority, and nothing was going to stop him from taking control. The girl tried again, this time with a softer voice. "I'm just asking for clarification. I'll leave if I'm wrong, but can you please explain why I'm being fined?" But instead of answering her, the officer snapped, "I don't have time for your games. Either move or face the consequences." His hands hovered near his cuffs, ready to escalate things further if necessary. Her calm demeanor remained intact, but it was obvious the situation was spiraling out of control. Despite her efforts to stay composed, the officer only seemed to feed off her patience, pushing harder and harder. And as the crowd of bystanders grew larger, so did the tension in the air. The girl stood firm, refusing to back down, but she could feel the pressure mounting. She couldn't understand why he wouldn't just listen. The officer's refusal to even consider her side left her with a sinking feeling. It felt like no matter what she said, he had already made up his mind. As the situation continued to escalate, the officer's harsh words echoed in the air. The girl stood quietly, her patience seemingly endless, but inside she was growing more frustrated by the second. The crowd had grown, some recording the incident, while others watched in silence, unsure of how to intervene. Just as the officer was about to write the fine, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The officer froze, momentarily distracted by the calm, yet authoritative voice. The crowd parted as a woman walked toward them, her steps confident and composed. She carried herself with an air of professionalism, her expression unreadable. The officer, still oblivious to her identity, didn't immediately recognize her. The woman looked at the officer for a moment before addressing him directly. "I asked you a question. Is there a problem?" He hesitated for a second, still holding the ticket pad. Just dealing with a minor issue, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his tone casual, though there was an edge of nervousness creeping in. "This young girl is causing a disturbance here, selling cookies in a restricted area." The woman's gaze hardened, her eyes scanning the situation. She didn't say anything at first, just observing the officer's actions, her silence making the tension feel even more suffocating. Then, with a calm but stern voice, she introduced herself. "I am the owner of this station." The officer's face instantly turned pale. He looked at the woman again, his expression shifting from arrogance to confusion, and then to shock as the realization hit him. "Wait, what?" he stammered, taking a step back, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. "Yes," the woman said, her voice still calm but filled with authority. "I'm the owner of this police station, and this young girl, my daughter, is not only innocent, but she's done nothing wrong." The officer's confidence crumbled, and in that moment his earlier bravado vanished. His eyes widened, and his mouth went dry. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. The woman's position was undeniable, and the officer was left standing there, stunned by his own mistake. Panic set in. He began to stutter, his words tumbling out in an apology. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't know. I didn't realize who she was. I'm just doing my job. It's just a misunderstanding." His hands fumbled with the ticket book, but he couldn't bring himself to write anything further. The situation had gone completely out of his control. The mother's calm presence was enough to silence him, and as she spoke, the officer's embarrassment deepened. "You've overstepped your authority today, officer," she said softly but firmly, "and your actions will be addressed." The officer stood frozen, his mind racing as he struggled to regain his composure. The crowd around them watched in silence, witnessing the stark shift in power and the officer's quick fall from arrogance to panic. The mother, still calm, glanced at her daughter, who had watched the entire exchange with a steady gaze. She nodded slightly to her, as if reassuring her that everything was going to be okay. Then, with one final look at the officer, she turned and began walking away, her daughter following closely behind her. The officer was left standing there, speechless, his face flushed with embarrassment as the realization of what he had done sank in. The officer stood there, frozen, as the mother's words sank in. His confidence, which had been so solid just moments ago, was now completely gone. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he knew it. The calm and composed woman before him was no longer just a concerned mother standing up for her child. She was an authority figure who commanded respect, and he was powerless in this moment. The mother didn't raise her voice, but her words carried weight. "You need to understand something," she said, her tone sharp but measured. "You may wear that badge, but it does not give you the right to treat others with disrespect, especially not someone just trying to do their job." She stepped forward, her gaze fixed firmly on the officer's face, unwavering. "You're here to protect and serve, not intimidate and belittle. And today, you've failed that duty." The officer's eyes widened slightly, and his previously defiant posture wavered. He shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her steady gaze. His earlier conviction, the belief that he was in control of the situation, began to crumble. I'm sorry, ma'am," he stammered, his voice faltering. "It wasn't personal. I just thought—" She didn't let him finish. "Enough," she said, her voice firm and commanding. She didn't need to hear excuses. She knew exactly what had happened, and she wasn't about to let him justify his actions. "Your behavior has consequences, not just for you, but for the people who are watching. You've shown them what abuse of power looks like. But it ends here." Her words rang clear in the air, and the officer's face turned red with a mix of embarrassment and realization. He had misjudged this situation, and now he had to face the truth of his actions. He began again, but he couldn't find the words. His eyes dropped to the ticket book in his hands, his usual source of power, and he was ashamed to see how weak it had become in his grip. "You're going to cancel that fine right now," she ordered, her voice calm but full of authority. The officer glanced down at the ticket in his hands, then back up at her. His shoulders slumped, the realization of the gravity of his mistake weighing heavily on him. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered, quickly starting to tear up the ticket. His hands were shaky, fumbling with the paper as he tried to undo the damage he had caused. The act felt almost robotic, as if he was performing a task he never thought he would have to do. She stood there, watching him, her presence still commanding respect, even as she held back any further anger. "This won't happen again," she said quietly, but firmly, as if to remind him that this was not just about the fine. Not to anyone. Ever. The officer couldn't look at her. His face burned with humiliation, and the silence between them grew heavy. He muttered another apology, though it was clear that no words could erase what had just occurred. "I'm sorry," he repeated, almost to himself as much as to her, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. The mother gave a small nod, and without another word she turned toward her daughter. The young girl, having watched the entire scene unfold, stood tall beside her mother, a quiet sense of pride filling her chest. She had seen her mother take control of the situation and show the officer what real authority looked like. Her heart swelled with relief as the tension slowly drained away. Together, they began walking away, their steps steady and confident. The officer, still rooted to the spot, was left standing behind them, humiliated and unsure of what to do next. He had lost his battle with authority, and he knew it. His pride had been shattered, and the image of the woman and her daughter walking away in dignity was something he would never forget. Around them, the crowd remained silent, unsure of how to react. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the entire scene as it unfolded. The officer's humiliation was now public, and the story would undoubtedly spread. But no one said a word as the mother and daughter walked off, their heads held high, knowing they had just done something powerful, something that would leave a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed it. As they disappeared into the crowd, the officer was left standing there in stunned silence, alone with his thoughts. His actions had been exposed for what they were, and now he had to face the consequences, not from the woman he had targeted, but from himself. His pride had been stripped away, leaving only a deep sense of shame. As the officer stood in silence, his humiliation in full view, the story began to spread like wildfire. What had been a simple but unjustified interaction between a police officer and a young Girl Scout quickly escalated into a public spectacle. News outlets picked up the video of the exchange, while social media platforms were flooded with reactions. People across the country and even around the world were shocked at the officer's behavior, and conversations about police abuse of power and racial profiling became unavoidable. The story of the young black girl being mistreated by a police officer struck a nerve with people from all walks of life. The officer's dismissive attitude toward the girl was hard to ignore, and many wondered how someone entrusted with public authority could treat a child like that. What started as a small infraction, selling cookies in an area that the officer deemed off-limits, had turned into a moment of racial profiling and excessive force. The officer's quick decision to escalate the situation, his refusal to listen to the girl's explanation, and the way he wielded his badge as a tool for intimidation made people realize how deep these issues ran. The video of the incident quickly went viral, and it didn't take long for people to start speaking out. The conversation about police bias was reignited, with people sharing their own stories of being unjustly targeted, racially profiled, and mistreated by law enforcement. It became apparent that this wasn't just about one officer, but a pattern of behavior seen in many interactions between police officers and communities of color. The issue of systemic racism in policing was suddenly front and center. People of all backgrounds began to weigh in, pointing out the need for change and the importance of treating everyone with fairness and respect, no matter their race or background. The mother, who had been a silent presence through much of the encounter, now became the central figure in the aftermath of the incident. With her position and influence, she decided to use the platform that came with her role to address the injustice her daughter had faced. Speaking to the media, she called for accountability, not just for the officer, but for the entire system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Her words were strong, clear, and full of conviction. This isn't just about what happened to my daughter. This is about every person who has ever been treated unfairly simply because of their race. This behavior is unacceptable, and it's time for us to make sure that those who hold power are held accountable. Her words carried weight. She wasn't just another voice in the crowd. She was someone who had the authority to make real change. She called for better training for officers, especially regarding how they handle situations with people of color. She demanded that police departments across the country do more to address racial profiling and discrimination. "We cannot continue to let this slide," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "We need accountability, we need respect, and most importantly, we need change." Her call to action didn't go unheard. Communities across the country rallied behind her. Social media exploded with messages of support, with people echoing her call for change. The hashtag #Justice for her daughter trended, and a movement started to take shape. People who had once remained silent were now sharing their own stories, their own frustrations, and their own hopes for a better future. The conversation quickly shifted from one isolated incident to a national conversation about justice, equality, and the importance of addressing the systemic issues within law enforcement. The media outlets that had originally covered the story began to run follow-up pieces, interviewing activists, lawyers, and community leaders who advocated for stronger regulations and reforms in policing. The officers' actions had sparked a chain reaction, and the story had become a symbol of resistance against injustice. This was no longer just about the Girl Scout or her mother. It was about a nation coming to terms with the uncomfortable truths about policing and racial inequality. The conversation about racial profiling, police violence, and accountability wasn't going away. It was being discussed at dinner tables, in schools, on television, and online. The moment of injustice had become a rallying cry for those who felt that they had been silenced for too long. As the mother continued to speak out, she received support from across the world. Activists in different countries praised her for her courage and for using her position to demand change. Organizations that had long fought for civil rights and equality voiced their backing, saying that this was the type of leadership the country needed. The national conversation shifted. People were no longer content to let things slide. They were demanding accountability from those in power, including the police, and they were calling for real, lasting change. But the conversation didn't stop with just words. People began taking action, Protests were organized in major cities across the nation, with thousands of people joining together to demand reform in policing. Rallies were held to show solidarity with those who had been mistreated, and to ensure that the message of justice and equality would not be forgotten. Signs that read, "No more racial profiling" and "Justice for all" were raised high in the air. People marched, organized, and made their voices heard. At the heart of it all was the mother's story, the story of a woman who stood up for her daughter, for her community, and for the principles of fairness and respect. What began as an unjust encounter had blossomed into a movement for change, and now it was clear that the message was resonating across the country. People were waking up, speaking out, and taking action. They were demanding that the justice system reflect the values of respect, equality, and accountability, values that every person should be able to rely on, no matter their race or background. The ripple effect of this story was undeniable. It was not just a personal victory for one mother and her daughter. It was a victory for all who had been treated unfairly, and it became a symbol for those who believed that change was possible. The conversation was far from over, but this was the moment where things began to shift. The story comes to a close with a lesson that strikes at the heart of justice and equality. It emphasizes the importance of treating everyone with fairness, respect, and dignity, regardless of their background, race, or appearance. The events that unfolded highlighted how a single act of injustice can ripple through a community and ignite a conversation that sparks change. What started as a seemingly small misunderstanding turned into a moment of reflection for society. The central message is clear. No one is above being held accountable, no matter how powerful or important they may be. Whether someone wears a badge, holds a position of authority, or stands in the spotlight, they must be held to the same standard of respect and fairness as everyone else. The officer, who initially thought he was above reproach, learned the hard way that abusing authority has consequences, sometimes far greater than anyone expects. The story also underscores the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it seems daunting or when authority figures try to intimidate you. The young girl, despite being initially wronged, stood firm in her calmness and integrity. It was her mother who provided the final push for justice, her voice standing strong, her resolve unshakable. Together, they showed how sometimes it takes one voice, one moment of truth, to shift the narrative and change the course of an entire situation. The lesson learned from this experience is also a call to action. We must always stand up for what's right. Even when faced with figures of power who think they are beyond reproach, we have the responsibility to challenge injustice. The mother's quick thinking, authority, and decision to call out the officer's behavior demonstrated that, no matter what position someone holds, they are not exempt from accountability. Finally, the importance of respect for others cannot be overstated. Treating people with kindness and dignity, regardless of their race, gender, or status, must be a core value in society. In the end, this story serves as a reminder that respect for one another, regardless of societal positions, is fundamental for true justice and equality to flourish. This moment, born from the confrontation of racial profiling and police misconduct, became a defining point that inspired countless others to speak out, demand change, and continue advocating for fairness. The impact of standing up for what is right ripples across communities, and it begins with a single step toward holding others accountable and ensuring that dignity is granted to all. The officer learned that his actions, unchecked by respect or accountability, led to a loss of his pride and position. Meanwhile, the young girl, her mother, and the community they represented grew stronger in their pursuit of fairness and justice. The lesson here is simple, yet profound. When we stand together for fairness, when we demand respect, and when we hold everyone accountable for their actions, we create a more just society for everyone.